My guest tonight is James Corbett of the Corbett Report. He comes on the show tonight to discuss his rather excellent documentary that came out a few weeks ago, How Big Oil Conquered the World, or The Rise of the Oiligarchy. It's the title I like. But so James, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Well, thank you for coming on. Listen, this documentary it's very sweeping, but it's a wonderful distillation of a very complex history. So I want to compliment you on that.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad it came across that way because I realized as I was doing it that it got to a point where every single section that I was working on could have been a documentary unto itself. So I'm glad that it does come across as sweeping, but hopefully comprehensible. And
that's what we encourage, because people who watch this documentary who may not be familiar with the history, there's libraries of books written on each of these topics, and you can really sink your teeth into it, and you really make a career out of delving into each one of these topics, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's the wars, like the oil wars, the geostrategy, the British geostrategy, and all this against Germany, the rise of the oil barons in the United States and all the intrigues that it involved in, and of course the post-war era with the rise of the Bretton Woods system, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and the oil crisis of the engineered oil crisis of the 70s, which I'm sure we'll get into. So yeah, it is a great history. For those who are familiar with it, it's a great, again, just a great, I guess you could say, just a brief topic of a reminder of all these things and how they're all interrelated. And so it really, I think it's a documentary for everybody. So I really encourage it.
Good. Well, that was certainly the intention. And really, I mean, in many ways, I said this before in a previous interview, I'd like to reiterate it. In many ways, this is kind of a culmination of the past, decade of research that I've done now on so many different things, and it ties a lot of them together. And I think this is one of the core underlying threads of that narrative that I've been really painting for the past not going on 9 years now at CorbettReport.com. So again, if it seems like it covers a vast amount of information, that's because it really is a condensation of really thousands and thousands of hours of research.
And unfortunately, there's no substitute for putting that time into it. You have to.
No.
Yeah. Now we can hope to save some people some time by sparing them the the lies and illusions that the status quo, the establishment, retails to them in the corporate media or the established education systems, things like that. But at the end of the day, you got to sit down, you got to turn off the TV, maybe get a cup of coffee, or put on some jazz music or some classical music and read and do some reading, so you can really get your teeth into this. But let's get into the documentary itself. Here we have the documentary is broken up into, I guess, roughly 4 parts, and you have the birth of the oligarchy, and that part kind of centers on the rise of the Rockefellers. And what's particularly interesting about it is his father, William Avery Rockefeller. What was his business?
What was his business? He was basically a scammer, a trickster, and he was quite notorious amongst the people that knew him for being such. I mean, there was no doubt about it. He would use all sorts of different tricks to try to scam people in different places. There were stories of him going to towns and showing up with a slate and some chalk and basically pretending to be deaf-mute, and basically communicating with people that way in order to try to beg money off of them and things like that. I mean, just total scams. And so he was quite nefarious for that. And unfortunately, he did come across as something of a lovable rogue and was quite a handsome man from all accounts. So he got away with a lot. But in fact, he was I mean, the moniker Devil Bill was applied to him sometimes and was unfortunately quite appropriate. He was not just philanderous, but there was accusations of rape in Cayuga in 1849 that caused him to flee his family. And he was actually in a bigamous marriage in Canada, and at the same time was fathering two more children by a third woman. So he was definitely, not a very morally upstanding person, shall we say. And I found the whole story of Devil Bill interesting because it is generally acknowledged, even in the kind of Rockefeller whitewash type documentaries you might find on PBS or those types of books that are written about the Rockefeller family. They don't really hide Devil Bill per se, but the narrative that we're given is that, oh well, John D learnt from his father, oh, this is an evil man, but he was raised by his mother, who was a very pious woman, so he turned into a very pious, religious man, and that's kind of what shaped him to be different from his father. But I on the other hand see the similarities, and whereas of course Devil Bill was really just some sort of sociopath or psychopath who was able to treat people as just basically means to an end, in a very brute way, in a way that was easily demonstrably morally reprehensible. John Dee was really just quite a bit sharper about it, and was able to go about it in a way that absolutely did change people's lives, and to some extent, I think we'd have to say for the better. That's because I think the most insidious evil is perpetrated by giving people at least a little bit of what they want. If you're just 100% plain old evil like Devil Bill, you're going to be rejected by society, and you're not really going to make it very far in order to get into positions of power to have real power over people. But if you give people at least a little bit of what they want, then you can go a lot further. And I think that's really what John Dee ultimately ended up learning from Devil Bill. And of course, one of the famous quotes that we have from Devil Bill himself was that he bragged that I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp. And there's stories of, I believe it was David Rockefeller, or one of the David Rockefeller generation, talking about John Dee always trying to swindle or cheat the boys out of different deals or trades. He'd always try to do things like that in order to basically teach them how to be ruthless in business. And that was something that was important and ingrained in the family from a very young age. So those types of stories just show that although the Devil Bill story is usually treated as some sort of interesting backstory, that's some sort of a sideshow to the Rockefeller story, in some ways I think of it as being really the core of the Rockefeller story.
And he literally was a snake oil salesman, correct?
Yes, that's right. Sorry. And to answer your question, yes, he did actually pawn off a snake oil called rock oil, a tonic. It was a completely useless tonic that it was just a mixture of laxative and petroleum. He went from town to town pawning it off on people. Literally a snake oil salesman, which is interesting because, of course, as I go on to detail in the documentary, yes, the Rockefellers and their oligarchical brethren did, of course, give rise to the modern pharmaceutical industry and the sort of modern snake oil. And again, I think the connection is perhaps more explicit than some people would like to admit. As I point out in the documentary, the name that Devil Bill marketed his rock oil snake oil tonic under was Nujol, as in new oil. And Standard Oil, ultimately in the early 20th century, spun off Nujol as a laxative that they sold under their Stanco subsidiary. So they literally took the name Nujol from Devil Bill and continued using it for their own purposes in the new snake oil industry.
That's great. That's so interesting. And of course, you alluded to some of these hagiographies that are produced about the Rockefellers, I guess you could say. I think one you used in the documentary is from the American Experience one, I believe.
That's right, yes.
And wasn't that brought to you by ConocoPhillips or ExxonMobil or something?
Not only that, but I remember there was a connection with, I think it was WGBH in Washington, is actually owned by a Rockefeller, Sharon Percy Rockefeller.
Okay. Yeah, well,
married into the Rockefeller family. So there's a lot of connections like that between the various hagiographies and the family itself.
Yeah, so it's the Rockefellers having to deal with their wealth and their noblesse oblige, and how they struggle to improve the world. And yeah, that's that documentary. I happened to watch or listen to a bunch of it because Richard Grove pulled a lot of it on one of his Peace Revolution podcasts.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
I mean, it is. I mean, it is important for I think people who are interested to at least understand that story, that version of the story.
Of
And there are a
course,
lot of
yes.
facts in there, but of course they're spun, as I say, in a way that paints the family in the best possible
Hmm.
light.
Hmm. And it's just interesting now. Now, Devil Bill had to be somewhat successful because apparently he loaned John D. Rockefeller $1,000 to, which wasn't a small amount of money in that day, to start his
No.
business. So he
Yes, that's right.
he was somewhat of a
And of course, he paid 9% interest
yeah,
on it, as David Rockefeller points out.
yeah,
Yes, he
like
paid 9% interest, and it was $1,000 loan to start his
yeah.
career off. So yes, the money, the seed money for the Rockefeller fortune, literally came from Devil Bill.
Hmm. So you have John D. Rockefeller, I guess, I guess you could say a bookkeeper. About
That's right. He started out as a bookkeeper.
yeah.
I can't remember exactly what business he was in, but he was interested in the petroleum business right from the time when it started taking off, and he was reading about it and getting very much
Hmm.
interested in it. And he ended up teaming up with one of the people that he was working with in a little project to try to start their own petroleum refinery, and they got into that business. And from that, he started leveraging control by basically strong arming various people in Cleveland, and he ultimately took over the Cleveland market, which at the time was really the booming place for the refining, because he had worked out basically the real money was to be made from refining, not from digging the wells. That
Yeah.
was you could get money if you were lucky and struck the right place, but if you had real business acumen, you could find a way to cut corners here and there and save a penny here and there and really make a business out of it. And that was really his dream.
So in 1870, Standard Oil was incorporated, and that's when they borrow heavily from the banks. One is National City Bank in Cleveland. I think I mentioned to you before recording that is rumored to be owned by the Rothschilds. But as I said, if you're involved in banking at some level,
Especially in that era.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
you're going to run into the Rothschilds.
Yeah.
But of course, he gets he gains a measure of success. This is the age when oil is being used primarily for lighting, right?
Yes, exactly. So at the time when when the oil industry was first taking off, it was primarily used for kerosene and for lamp oil, basically. And that was what it was for. That was why it was being used. That was why it was so wildly popular, because it was at least in part replacing the whale blubber that was being used for lamp oil, that was becoming increasingly expensive as whales were being basically whaled to near to extinction. So they needed a replacement, and this was the sort of perfect technology for that. It ended up, as I say, vastly improving the lives
Yes.
of a lot of people who were able to light their homes much more cheaply than they would have if they were still relying on whale blubber. So that's why it became, I think, so important. It was such an important industry. It was really, in many ways, one of the most important industries that has ever happened, being really one of the underlying parts of the key part of the Industrial Revolution.
And of course, as he acquires more wealth and power within the industry, and like you said, at this point in the game, although he's slowly established his dominance, the price of lighting oil is dropping for the consumer. Right.
That's right.
So
I don't
yeah.
recall the exact prices, but there's no doubt that the price went down considerably after the sort of the initial craze of the oil boom sort of took off when Colonel Edwin Drake, when Colonel
Yes.
Edwin Drake struck oil in 1859. That was really the beginning of the boom, and at that point, it was a very disorganized thing, and prices were obviously high because there was just no infrastructure for it. But the consolidation of that infrastructure through the monopolization that Standard Oil represented was, again, it did provide that dropping of the price for the consumer at that level.
And it's this point that he develops what he called our plan to the South Improvement Company, and this is where he seeks to destroy the independent oil men and come to dominate the industry.
That's exactly right. So it was around the time of the incorporation in 1870. He was quite highly leveraged at that point. He was deeply indebted to the banks that had forwarded the money for that incorporation and for the really getting Standard Oil off the ground. And that's exactly when his plan started to come to fruition, where he was going to use, obviously, deals with the railroads and a lot of secret subterfuge, where he would buy out competition, but then he would continue operating them as if they were competition. He wouldn't announce the merger or
Yeah.
the deal, so then they could go out and buy other competition through him for him, and no one would know that it was him buying it all up, so that he could get it at cheaper price. And this all culminated in I can't remember what it was called, the Cleveland disaster or something, some Cleveland calamity or something like that, where he ended up consolidating most of the Cleveland refinery in just a period of months. And after that point, it was pretty much assured that Standard Oil was going to be the monopoly in the United States.
Now, again, he's doing this within the industry, within the business itself. So the people he's hurting are his competition. But still, at this point, the vast majority of the American people are benefiting from his business acumen. You could say, right?
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
right. I mean, at the end of the day, the consumer really just sees the dropping price and probably doesn't understand the dangers of giving one company,
Yeah.
headed by this one man, such an incredible amount of control and power and money.
But again, it really becomes a problem because I know his success in the industry attracted a lot of criticism because he was known as a very, very ruthless and vicious businessman. I don't know if that means he was involved in any illegality. That's up for speculation.
Yeah, well, exactly right. I mean, we should be clear that one of the groundbreaking sort of works at the time was by Ida Tarbell, who wrote this expose that was wildly popular, that came out around the turn of the century.
And who was her father?
Yes, her father was one of the men who was crushed by Rockefeller, and he was one of the ones that most of the time when he was taking over these competitors, he would offer them some sort of deal,
Yeah.
for Standard Oil stock. And if they accepted it, generally, because Standard Oil obviously became what it became, they ended up, very rich themselves. Her father ended up not taking that deal, so got completely crushed and torn apart. So she, I assume, had a personal axe to grind.
Yeah.
But she did write this expose that, was extremely popular and really did help to shape public perception of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller, very much to the negative around the turn of the century. And she found some things that were certainly questionable, and as you say, there is questions as to whether it was strictly illegal at the time. But at any rate, in 1910, of course, the Supreme Court ultimately did rule that the Standard Oil was a monopoly, and so they tried to bust it up. And of course, we all know how that worked out. It worked out beautifully for John D. and the other Standard Oil stockholders.
Yeah, at the very time they're passing antitrust legislation, they're also practicing severe protective tariff laws, which of course encourages monopoly within the United States because it snuffs out competition. But that's politics,
Yeah, exactly right. And it of course it worked exactly the way it always does, and from their perspective always should. It benefited the few at the top.
And I believe the Sherman Antitrust Act, wasn't he brother of William Tecumseh Sherman?
You may be right about that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
The one who helped establish political monopoly within the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
By crushing the South. But that's a whole other issue. But yeah, again, I want to, because it's very easy to paint this man as a villain, but really what he is, he's a very far-seeing, very ingenious, very risk-taking. He has a lot of guts in business. So he's taking a lot of personal risk at first, but he wins out. He becomes dominant within the industry. And at that point, it becomes more problematic because he starts to leverage his wealth politically, and he becomes instead of just being a baron within the industry, he starts to become an oligarch, and there's a distinction there. But across the ocean, of course, his success is creating competition. Correct?
Well, of course, yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously, an industry like that is not going to arise without some degree of competition. So I think the American monopoly, as we say, was pretty firmly established and fairly quickly. But the internationally, there was still a lot of room for other companies to arise. So one of them that did arise in that early stage in the late 19th century was, well, actually, it started out as two companies. There was the Royal Dutch Oil Company, Petroleum Company, that was founded with a grant from the King of the Netherlands, King William III at the time. Quickly taken over by Queen Wilhelmina, who ended up becoming the world's first female billionaire, or at least admitted female billionaire, because of her business acumen, including her holdings in what became Royal Dutch Shell. The other half of that was the Shell Transport and Trading Company. It was first established by Marcus Samuel Sr., but ultimately Marcus Samuel, I believe, Jr., took over the company and was running it by the time of the late 1800s, where the Shell Transport Company basically became the shipping company for the Rothschilds, who, along with the Nobels, had moved into the Caucasus region, which was opening up the Russian nobility had opened it up to private development, private petroleum development in the 1870s, and so the Nobels and the Rothschilds moved in there immediately, the French Rothschilds, and they started to really squeeze out the competition there. And so then the Rothschilds hired Marcus Samuel to get their Caspian oil out into East Asian markets, which at the time were being pursued by the Rockefellers and Standard Oil, but there was still, as I say, a great room for competition there. And Marcus Samuel managed to do what no one had done to that point, which was build a oil tanker which could meet the standards of the Suez Canal Company, which controlled passage through the Suez Canal. And they successfully did that. They've sailed the first tanker called the Murex through the canal in 1892. And that was a huge feat, a huge coup, really, for that what became Royal Dutch Shell in the early 1900s. So basically, the Royal Dutch Petroleum Company, which was also developing petroleum deposits in Borneo, along with Shell, they basically saw the writing on the wall with Standard Oil and decided to merge. It took a few years. There was a couple of different sort of intermediate companies, but in 1907 they became Royal Dutch Shell. And so it was the Rothschild Nobel Caspian Oil that was really the underlying part of that. So the Rothschilds did hold shares in the Asiatic Petroleum Company, which was one of those intermediary companies before Royal Dutch Shell. And then when Royal Dutch Shell was created, it becomes murkier. But to this day, it is still believed that the Rothschilds and the Dutch royal family are two of the major shareholders in Shell, what is today Royal Dutch Shell.
And of course, in Persia, you have the British making their mark.
Yes, exactly right. So in the early part of the 20th century, in 1901, there was a socialite, William Knox Darcy, who managed to secure a concession from the King of Persia, which was just incredible, an incredible coup. It was exclusive rights to prospect for oil throughout the entire country for 60 years. And he spent 7 years funding a search through Persia for oil, 7 fruitless years where they were not striking anything. And they got to the point in 1908 where Darcy and his backers and co-investors sent a telegram to their geologists telling them, stop, dismantle your equipment, come home. You're not going to find anything. And he disobeyed that order, and he just kept drilling. And it was really just weeks after he got that telegram that he struck oil, and what was to become an extremely lucrative find. And so the Burma Oil moniker that they were going on under was spun off. That particular Persian oil concession was spun off as Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And the British government ended up taking majority control of the company's shares in 1914. And the Anglo-Persian Oil Company eventually became British Petroleum. So that represents the British crown, basically. To this day, I think BP is still an extension of British foreign policy and foreign power.
So but what you have here in the United States, you have people from relatively modest means creating their own empire, financial empire, and becoming powerful that way, which is, you could say, more of the American way. We'd like to think.
Yeah, it fits the narrative anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Of course, in Europe, you have the British royal families,
British royalty, Dutch royalty, and the unofficial Rothschild royalty.
And it's more top down, I guess you could say, than
and certainly old world established wealth. Yeah.
But at some point or another, the Rockefellers become powerful enough to become, I guess, amongst them. But okay, so here you have this. We have the, I guess you could say, the creation of the oil giants by the early 20th century. British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, and I guess you could have of course, the various companies. Standard Oil eventually became Exxon Mobil, Esso, as it got broken up and all that. Eventually you had Texaco, but now they're, I think, used to be the Seven Sisters. Now they're down to 3 now. So back.
Yeah, it's been winnowing down, but basically it's just mergers. Yeah. But I believe Texaco came from Spindletop, which wasn't Standard Oil.
Yeah, which was interesting. Yeah, because just when I think just when he was his monopoly was as peak, Spindletop went off.
Yeah.
But of course that had an effect in making eventually would make gasoline more marketable, which had an effect on the industry itself.
Well, it brought the price of
Yeah,
gasoline down to the point where there was no question anymore between gasoline as a fuel for automotives and alcohol, which had been toyed with as a fuel. And there was a point in America where alcohol was available for fuel at a cheaper rate than gasoline, but that didn't last very long as the Spindletop wells, including 100,000 barrels a day, started coming online. Then that just pushed the price down to the point where there was no question that gasoline was going to win out. And certainly with some of the underhanded tricks that played out from that point, with as I go on to detail in the documentary, with Rockefeller supporting the prohibition movement, maybe not for the virtuous reasons that he wanted to project in public.
yeah, it's the old bootleggers of Baptist
Yeah,
alliance there.
that old merger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is where you state in the documentary that at this point it's nowhere clear that oil will become the dominant energy source. There's still competition, but then again, as you say in the section, you say competition is a sin. This is where, as you alluded to with prohibition, where Rockefeller starts to, I guess, leverage his wealth politically to affect policies that don't directly affect oil, but do, because with prohibition wasn't there although it banned alcohol for consumption, didn't ban it for energy,
Yeah.
but it required an additive.
Yes, exactly.
Made it no longer competitive.
Right. So to give people the background on this, ethyl alcohol had been used as lamp fuel and engine fuel since the early 19th century. So it was an established competitor to petroleum byproducts and gasoline. And so there had been a lot of work with that. And although, I mean, people will probably bring up alcohol has a lower heat value than gasoline, so it requires more energy to burn. But because of the higher compression ratio in alcohol engines, you could actually offset the lower heat value. So actually, there was a study in 1908 by the USGS and US Navy that found that they were equivalent. Alcohol engines and gasoline engines were fuel economy equivalent because of that offsetting the higher compression ratio. So it was a viable technology. And as I say, there was a brief point at which ethyl alcohol was available at a cheaper price in the United States than gasoline. It was a very brief window, but still, it was at least feasible for some time that there was going to be competition. And that's, I mean, one of the things that people might have forgotten is that the original Model T was designed to be run on either gasoline or alcohol because Henry Ford was a supporter of alcohol fuel. In fact, he thought that the idea was extremely important for the sort of independent American farmer that he thought was extremely important to the American economy overall. So his vision, as he told the New York Times, I believe in the 1920s, he said the fuel of the future is going to come from fruit like that sumac out on the road, or from apples, weeds, sawdust, almost anything. There is fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that can be fermented. So his vision was this very, very, very different vision of the fuel of the future, which was going to be this very distributed, impossible to monopolize thing that you could literally grow, anywhere. Anyone could grow it. And if the infrastructure was there, presumably they could grow it and make it into ethyl alcohol fuel for cars or whatever else fairly cheaply. But that infrastructure ultimately did not get put in place. As you say, one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons was Spindletop making gasoline cheaper. But one of the other reasons was, as you say, during Prohibition, although in 1906 there was an alcohol tax that had been on the books since the Civil War to help pay for the Civil War, but we all know how those taxes tend to persist after their supposed mandate. And so by 1906, finally it was repealed. So that brought ethanol down in price. But almost immediately, the prohibition movement, which had been around for decades but had been kind of floundering and politically directionless, was really gaining momentum by that point. And it was gaining momentum specifically because of the Anti-Saloon League, which was started in Ohio. Of course, Rockefeller's not his home state, but his home base of operations for Standard Oil, and by his longtime personal friend, Howard Hyde Russell. And John D. helped bankroll the Anti-Saloon League, and lobbied for prohibition, and ultimately got it through. And one of the effects of prohibition was that ethyl alcohol as a fuel was still, you could still market it, but in order to do so, you had to add certain petroleum derivatives, ironically enough, in order to poison it, make it poisonous, so that you couldn't drink the fuel, basically. So that actually, I mean, interestingly enough, that ended up in this case that you can read about, where there were hundreds of poisonings, people literally dying during the prohibition because of things like that. That the prohibition included the prohibition on drinking of fuel alcohol, which again was only accomplished through the adding of these derivatives. So basically, by that point, it was guaranteed that alcohol fuel was going to go by the wayside, and at that point, they just started looking at it as an additive to gasoline for to help prevent engine knock.
Yeah. So yeah, that's this example of them using the political process to snuff out competition. And
Yes.
and also another good example. It's an early example of, say, AstroTurf activism.
Yes, exactly right. I mean, exactly right. And it's one of those things that it continues to be effective because, again, it does have a very visible, very obvious social side of it, but a very subtle and very indirect second side of it that people would generally would never even consider until they start to really piece the puzzle together. And unfortunately, sometimes that can only be done in hindsight with the benefit of history.
And the same thing also was done with marijuana and hemp for the benefit of the petrochemical industry too, right? DuPont,
of course, exactly.
Because hemp products would make rope, nylon, wanted to make nylon marketable, and they couldn't with available hemp. And
that's whip up reefer madness and get people scared of it.
And that, of course, that has long-term consequences because a lot of the stuff that stores our food are in plastic, which are petrochemically based, laced with all types of chemicals, which have health effects. Whereas you could, if they were packaged in hemp, that wouldn't be the case. Even the clothing, by the way, if clothing were made by hemp as opposed to nylon, some say the nylon clothing has a long-term health effect on you.
Well, people might remember that in about a decade ago, there was the big brouhaha about BPA, bisphenol A, one of the derivatives of which plastic is made from. And interestingly enough, that chemical, it was actually used as an estrogen mimicking compound. It was actually used medicinally in the 1930s. But for some reason, they decided to make it as one of the essential ingredients in a lot of different plastics, and even the sort of substance that lines food cans and things of that nature, even though they knew that it had those effects. And then decades and decades and decades later, when the public starts to find out about it, it's all this, oh, who would have known? Oh, well, okay, we'll start withdrawing that. So I think, again, we can see darker agendas at play. It's just never, of course, going to be explicitly stated like that.
Population control. So, here we're at a point now where they've made gasoline dominant, and of course it's serendipity because they've perfected the internal combustion engine, and automobiles now are on the road. But then, you have in the 40s, you have they destroy the public transport system, the rail system, and there was a conspiracy behind that. Want to get into that?
Yes, and the long story short, GM, along with Standard Oil of California and Firestone and a few others businesses, got into bed together in buying up something called National City Lines, which owned a number of different rail trolley car systems and lines in various cities. And basically, they ended up buying up and scrapping transit systems, public electric transit systems in 45 cities. And they put, what else would they put in their place? Of course, GM buses running on diesel powered from Standard Oil petroleum. So this was a pretty clear-cut case, and it did ultimately get litigated. And in 1947, they were in the National City Lines group consortium was indicted for conspiring to form a transportation monopoly. And in 1949, they were actually convicted on the second count of conspiring to monopolize sales of buses and supplies. And so, although they were actually convicted of this in federal court, Their punishment was the lightest of light slaps on the wrist, a $5,000 fine. And in fact, the director of Pacific City Lines, which oversaw the Pacific Electric system in Los Angeles, this $100 million incredible public transportation infrastructure that was then scrapped by Pacific City Lines, he was personally fined $1. And that was really the judge making a statement. Well, I don't think you guys are really that guilty, so you should get away with it, pretty much. And not surprisingly, who went on to become President Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense? It was the president of General Motors, Charles Wilson, who was the one who oversaw the creation of the Federal Interstate Highway System, which of course guaranteed that rail would not be a viable form of transport across America between cities. It was going to be dominated by the car and by the highway infrastructure, which again was paid for by the U.S. taxpayers for the benefit of GM and their buddies. So again, it's just mind-boggling the level at which this is operating. But I think we have to start to pull out to see the bigger picture of what these players are going for, because we in the general public are generally stymied by a lack of imagination about how these business players really operate and what they're going for, which self-evidently is consolidation of as much control over as much of the market as they can possibly get.
It is sort of, there's an ironic twist to that. The death of the railroad was political, because the creation of the railroad in the United States was very political.
yeah, exactly. In fact, a lot of the robber barons in the 19th century made their fortunes through rail. And, they as long as you know which way the political winds are blowing, you can jump on the next bandwagon before it leads to the station.
These aren't market decisions that are being taken. These are, it's all political entrepreneurship, all insider dealings and taxpayer subsidies, and even the creation of airports and the airlines were all subsidized.
Of course,
these weren't free market ventures. They're all the blessings of the federal government for some sort of social engineering scheme. So and that's the point here, because you mentioned the construction interstate highway system that ushers in the era that creates the automobile culture. It also facilitates the creation of suburbia, which changes the nation in many ways, demographically, politically, culturally. Creates, I guess you could say the bland middle class, the consumer culture. And I think people who have done research in this know that this was always the plan.
Yeah.
Even how some of the neighborhoods were designed, like Levittown and all that. And I think they were World War II engineers, I think, and they perfected mass, production of these homes, putting on these slabs real fast, But it changed the culture,
It certainly did, and it is important for us living as we do to even imagine that there was a different culture in America at some point. I mean, it's just so ingrained in the cultural imagination by this point that it even permeated down into Canada, where we watched all of your media secondhand, that America is a car culture. And
the automobile
cars all the time. It's all about the federalization of the car.
And one other thing, you get into geopolitics, which I think was very fascinating, because you mentioned the Baghdad to Berlin Railroad, and I guess the control of oil and how that's led to. I guess I could argue that it led to the 30 Years War between Britain and Germany.
Yes, exactly right. I wouldn't say that the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was the cause of World War I, but I think it shouldn't be overlooked as an exceptionally important contributor to the German-British rivalry that was going on at the turn of the century. It was extremely important. So for people who don't know, in 1889, Deutsche Bank led a consortium of German investors that managed to obtain a concession from the Turkish government, which at the time had control over Persia and the Mesopotamia, Iraq. Sorry, not Persia, Mesopotamia. And they managed to secure a concession for the building of a railway line from Berlin all the way down to Basra on the Gulf. And of course, that would go through Baghdad. So it was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And it was a 99-year concession with mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the line. So you have this 40-kilometer swath cutting right through what would become some of the most productive oil wells in the world. Of course, it wasn't known at that time, but it was suspected. And certainly, yes, this became a huge point of contention. And it's interesting to see. Ultimately, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we could say that that problem, quote unquote, was solved, quote unquote, by World War One, and the British basically wiping out Germany and taking over all of that area and breaking up the Ottoman Empire and taking over the steaming remains. But one of the things that they were doing behind the scenes, even before World War One started, was to try to move in on that concession and to try to consolidate control over that area. So basically, they moved in with their agents in Turkey. They actually, I mean, there was this group of London bankers that created the Turkish National Bank, which you would think was Turkish, but no, it was actually, I mean, it was essentially a British creation. And it was Sir Edward Castle and Hugo Baring and all of these British bankers who founded this Turkish National Bank, which I believe did have power to issue the Turkish currency. So again, just control over banking is control over politics, basically. And they managed to create a deal for the oil concessions in that area of Mesopotamia, and they basically strong-armed the Deutsche Bank consortium into a partnership where they took a junior cut of the deal that also included, of course, their mineral rights concessions along the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And so these bankers had already basically taken over the deal before World War I even broke out. But, I mean, the most ironic part of it all is that the final negotiations for Iraqi oil concessions with the Turkish government concluded on June 28th, 1914, the day that Archduke Ferdinand was shot and World War I, supposedly started. I mean, that is one of those incredible historical coincidences that really does shed some light into what's really maybe what the real start of World War I was about.
Yeah, because of course he was shot by Gabriele Princip, who's a member of the Black Hand, who some say links back to British intelligence and British Freemasonry.
Certainly some secret society connections going on there.
And that goes back to, again, to understand, you have to understand the British geostrategy of the Mackinder Doctrine. And that's where the sea power has to control the Eurasia.
Right, and exactly right. And if Berlin, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway went ahead and Germany had that direct access right down all the way to the Gulf, the threat to naval power, British naval power in that region was obvious. I mean, you have the direct ability to supply, and even if they wanted to send troops down into the region or whatever, and that was the type of lifeline that Britain was very, very scared of with this rising Germany, which is why it had to be put down.
And we see that today with the geopolitical jockeying between the Anglo-American power, the Atlanticist powers, versus this, I guess you could say, this nascent alliance between China, Russia, and possibly even Europe. Yes.
I don't know if alliance is the right word. I don't know if that really
what do you call it?
But yeah, some sort of grouping, consortium. Uneasy at times, but certainly the idea is there, and we see it reflected in various things. And I mean, we have on the Putin side, we have the Eurasian Economic Union, and then on the Xi Jinping side, we have the one road, one belt policy of China and their attempts to try to connect the region.
But it's very similar because you get Britain at the time of 1914 was this industrial power in a relative decline. Germany and Russia are on the rise, and so how do you knock them down a peg to maintain your dominance? You could say the same thing applies to the United States and Atlantic powers today. And you can if you look at China, if you look at Russia, you look at Europe's technical know-how, Russia's natural resources, and China's factories. Why do they need the United States? So that's part of the geopolitical jockey. But it's funny how there's things still, this conflict, a century ago, we still see the same, you could say the same issues arising today, different faces, but it's the same.
Yeah, but I see an exact parallel, actually, between the lead up to World War I and what's happening right now. And I think, to a certain extent, that's been engineered and allowed to happen and is being used as, in the same way World War I and World War II was used to shape the course of 20th century politics. I think we're going to be steered into a conflict to shape the course of 21st century politics.
And I guess you cite him in your documentary, but a good source in that is William Engdahl.
Yes, of course.
On all this these intrigues and geopolitical jockeying. To read his books, you'll get a good idea what's going on here. You certainly won't get it by watching the news media. So
no.
But then we shoot ahead of the post-war era. I think you phrased it perfectly in your In your documentary, you say just as the Rockefellers supplemented their oil fortune by going into banking, and the Rothschilds supplemented their banking fortune by going into oil. I mean, by going into oil.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And I think at that point, once it's about the oligarchy, rather than about the just the industrial concerns of it, I think it goes from being about wealth to being about power. And I think that's really what it represents at that level. The Rockefellers went into banking because that's where the power was, and the Rothschilds helped to consolidate oil because that's where the power was.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you have World War II occurs. Of course, we all know the outcome of that. Europe's destroyed industrially for a decade or so, and you have the creation of the Bretton Woods system, which is this gold exchange standard, very similar to the system that existed in the 20s, right after World War One, which collapsed eventually too, for similar reasons.
Well, with an important difference though, in that it enshrined the U.S. dollar really as the sort of gold standard, because the dollar itself was supposed to be pegged at $35 an ounce.
Yeah.
So really, it was all structured specifically to make the U.S. dollar the key linchpin of the world international monetary system.
But this lasts a mere 27 years. Want to explain why? And it gets us into 1973, the oil shocks. Let's get into that.
In some ways, you could say it lasted less than 27 years because there was already considerable strains on the system by the 1960s. It was all but a foregone conclusion that it was going to formally wrap up. And eventually, it did formally wrap up in August of 71 when Nixon formally declared an end to the gold window. He closed the gold window so that people couldn't redeem the dollar for the $35 an ounce that was mandated under the Bretton Woods system. And since the entire system was structured on that, I mean, that created at least you had the sort of notion that existed before that point, that there was some sort of notional backing to the international monetary system. But once that happened, I mean, it was just great chaos. So basically, the story is that the U.S. Since the U.S. dollar was the reserve currency, because it was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and other currencies were pegged or floated in exchange with the U.S. dollar, the U.S. dollar in a way had to act in a dual function, in a paradoxical function that's been pointed out by economists. One, it has to be widely spread enough and produced enough to underlie the entire global exchange system, but it also has to be stewarded over and kept under control so that you don't print too much, so that it doesn't devalue the currency. And whatever the balance in between those paradoxical forces are, clearly the U.S. wasn't doing that certainly in the 1960s, as they started to ramp up in Vietnam and the spending started to get completely out of control. So you got a number of countries that really started to worry about the system and started effectively cashing out. You had Germany and France trying to redeem their dollars for gold, and other countries. And it came to a point where the Federal Reserve was just not going to be able to cover those claims anymore. So in 71, Nixon ended that system and said, okay, you can't get gold for dollars anymore. But that, of course, as I say, left this huge, big question mark right in the center of international monetary system, which is, well, okay, so what do we do now? What is really backing this up? We're still structured in this way that the U.S. dollar is the sort of default global reserve currency, but why? And, what's going to prevent the United States from just printing billions and trillions and quadrillions of them, and why would we continue buying them? So that was really a sort of open question that hung out there for a few years, but not to fear, the oligarchs had their own plan for that.
And we have the Yom Kippur War, which apparently was planned in the spring of '73, right?
Well, let's dwell on this for a moment, because in the spring of '73, in May '73 specifically, there was the Bilderberg meeting. I'm sure most of your listeners will have at least heard of this. Of course, a high-level meeting amongst. It was really the Bilderberg group was founded in 1954 by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, aka part of that Royal Dutch Shell family, and it includes all of the uppermost of the British, European, American business, financial elite, as well as royalty, as well as industrial and media figures. I mean, it's obviously quite an exclusive club. Their meetings have been held in almost complete 100% secrecy for decades and decades. It's only in recent years that it's really started to receive any attention. And as a result, probably has become less important. But anyway, in 1973, in May 1973, they convened in Sweden, I believe, and in that meeting, they were in great detail, which we now know of because the meeting minutes are available. They've been leaked online. You can go and read them. In great detail, they were discussing oil from all sorts of different perspectives. In the European case, their idea of trying to consolidate some sort of organization for combating potential for price control from the oil petroleum exporting countries, OPEC. From the Americans' perspective, of course, they have their own plans that aren't necessarily in line with Europe. They were talking about Japan and some of the players in the East and how they were playing into this. But one of the things that they were discussing at great length was the possibility of an energy crisis. And specifically, in those documents, they were talking about oil prices going up to between $10 and $12 per barrel as a result of an oil crisis, which is strange because in spring of 73, there wasn't at least any particular trigger for such a crisis. I guess the mechanism was really there with OPEC and the growing clout of the producer nations, but there was no particular trigger for an impending energy crisis. But then, of course, later that year, the Yom Kippur War kicks off, and by October, OPEC is raising the rates. By December, they raise the rates again to $11.65 a barrel, right directly in that sweet spot, that 400% increase that the Bilderbergers were talking about in May of that year. So all of that, I mean, regardless of exactly how it was engineered, it certainly did come about exactly as they had predicted. And as William Engdahl reports, the Saudi king Faisal, his personal emissary, had specifically asked the Shah of Iran why he had demanded that particular price, a staggering 70% rise in oil prices from in October and then 400% in December. And the Shah of Iran apparently, reportedly, told this emissary, tell your king if he wants to know the answer to this question, he should go to Washington and ask Henry Kissinger, who, of course, is Rockefeller's minion, who, of course, both of them were at that May 1973 meeting. So, again, that's highly convenient. And really the upshot of this is that not only do they have the oil crisis, which of course for the oil majors isn't particularly a problem, they just pass on the high prices to consumers, but it also created the space for a sickly, diabolically brilliant secondary move by Kissinger, which was to construct the petrodollar. And basically that is a deal with Saudi Arabia that exists to some extent in some form to this day, that as long as the Saudis would price all of their oil sales in dollars, i.e. creating a constant demand for US dollars, because there is a constant demand for oil, then we'll protect you, we'll sell you arms, we'll do all that, we'll be your man in the region. And the other part of that deal was, of course, all of those dollars that you're getting for your oil sales, you'll recycle back through the U.S. You'll buy U.S. treasuries through U.S. banks, including, of course, the Chase Bank, headed by David Rockefeller himself at that time. So, again, win-win-win-win-win for the oligarchy, and lose-lose-lose for most of humanity.
So a vast pool of credit is opened up to the Treasury Department.
Exactly right. They get to print as much money as they need to go do their foreign wars of aggression, and it's all backed up by the global dependence on oil. And
you get this 400% increase in the price of oil, which automatically overnight converts a lot of these exploration deals, makes them profitable, like the North Sea and also the Alaskan pipeline, if I believe at the time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's such an important point, and one that really struck me in the research for this documentary that I don't think I had the chance to really convey. I was thinking, and probably still will do, another episode on the idea of peak oil, but something that comes across very clearly to people who have studied the history of this, that there are people right from the very beginning of the oil industry, I mean, really from the 1860s and 70s onward, there is no shortage of quotes about people worrying, there's too much oil, we're pumping too much oil, there's not going to be a market, there's way too much oil coming online. Over and over and over throughout the history of oil, this has been one of the primary concerns is, there's too much oil, we have to get the prices up. They've found a way to do that time and time again through various geopolitical machinations, economic machinations, you name it. But they've managed to do that. So although, of course, oil has been going down for the last couple of years, I think we've definitely seen some of that in our own lifetimes with some of the extremely high prices we've seen in the recent past.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I think this factors also into a particular sinister document, which is National Security Study Memorandum 200 by Henry Kissinger in 1974.
Yes, that's right. The genocidal plan to basically make food aid and other types of aid contingent on population control in various third world countries that are targeted for population reduction.
And these, I guess you could say, these oil shocks were integral to that plan, weren't they?
Yes, I mean they certainly did impinge on some of the areas, some of the oil areas, oil dependent areas that were suddenly going to be, scrambling to try to import enough energy to keep their economies going while trying to feed and clothe their populations, and that put them in a position where they were extraordinarily reliant on food aid and other types of aid coming from the U.S., which, again, was going to be tied up with all of these strings to do with population control. Mm-hmm. And that's not even to mention the Food for Peace program.
Mm-hmm. Which opens up to all types of demands using, it just gets into, I guess you could say, their vision for the world, the next part of the,
yes,
the world in their image, yeah. But then earlier on, you have things like the General Education Board, where Rockefeller, I think, donates $180 million to change American education.
Yeah, that's right. So really, this part of the documentary, "The World in Their Image," is talking about the way that wealth and that consolidation of control over the oil industry was parlayed into general power and control over the rest of society. And it's fascinating to look at that, because this is really a case study in how power is centralized, how it functions, how it can be amplified and extended across every field of human activity, which, again, you'd have to be a particular sort of person to even try to wrap your head around doing something like this. But anyway, apparently those people exist, and I think it's better that we look that squarely in the face. So really, the first part of this is the restitution of John D. Rockefeller's image in the public eye, which, as I say, by the time of Ida Tarbell and the types of press that John D. was getting in the run-up to the breakup of Standard Oil, it was atrocious. His name was dragged through the mud. He was looked upon as one of the key enemies of humanity. And so he literally, in a sense, created the PR industry. He hired Ivy Lee, who is really looked on as one of the founders of the modern PR industry, to restore his image. And they did all sorts of ridiculous tricks. They gave out dimes to orphans and caught that on camera. Oh, candid camera. Oh, look, it's John D. Rockefeller giving out dimes. That kind of thing.
Candid camera 1920.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just set up this camera and we'll have a spontaneous... Anyway, so it was pretty transparent, but it worked, and a lot of people started to see the reform. But really, the key of this reform started with education. That was the first thing that Rockefeller went after, because as in our own time, I think it's quite obvious, as long as you talk about, won't someone think of the children, let's give more money to schools, almost no one is going to say that's a bad thing. Everyone wants that. Everyone, of course, wants children to be educated, so how else do you do that other than through the public schooling system? And so the real first move in this was the creation of the University of Chicago, which John D. Rockefeller primarily funded into existence. And from that point, he consolidated a crew that, including Frederick Taylor Gates and others, that would go on to become his go-to men in the creation of what would become a sort of philanthropical monopoly that he was putting together. And so one of the first forerunner organizations of that was the General Education Board. As you say, it was created, I believe, in 1902 and endowed with $180 million. And let's keep in mind that's $1902, $180 million. We're talking billions equivalent today. I mean, just a staggering amount of money to throw at the education system generally. And of course, it was not for wonderful, beneficial, let's make everyone bright scholars who can think for themselves. Of course, it was for their own ulterior purposes. And I do quote in the documentary that quote from Frederick Taylor Gates, who wrote in one of the works that he expounded his idea, the Country School of Tomorrow, which again sounds like this wonderful thing that this wonderful General Education Board is is giving all this money to. But in that, he specifically says, in our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or science. We are not to raise from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. So, of course, the question is, well, what are they doing? And the question is, they are creating pliant workers for the industrial concerns of the industrial monopolists who are funding these very programs.